Greetings, classmates and Professor Crum. I'm summarizing Chapter 5 of Faith of the Founders in the American Republic by Mark David Hall and Daniel Dreibach, Oxford Scholarship 2014. The chapter is called The Influence of Reformed Tradition in the American Founding. Hall proposes that, quote, Reformed or Calvinist political thought and idea can be traced from John Calvin in the 1500s to the American founding, end quote. Reformed ideas and influence were a large part of the, quote, tensions that rose between the colonies and Great Britain, end quote. He argues that most historians place the limelight on American revolutionary heroes like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Paine, and Ben Franklin, who all had more Unitarian views about God and spirituality. These historians analyze history from a consensus historian's view of the American Revolution and its colonial leaders during the time period of our nation's founding. Hall's critique is supported by an article from The Economist by Anonymous 2011 that states founders like, quote, Jefferson and Madison were protecting the church and government from being so intertwined as to destroy one another. In essence, they helped ensure that, quote, America remained a deeply religious country, end quote. Hall draws from a consensus view of history with some respect given to Whig viewpoints, such as a focus on liberty and freedom along with providence. He argues that most historians don't focus on, quote, the fact that most churches during the founding era of the American colonies were Calvinist churches and New England was dominated by them, end quote. These churches and their ministers had heavy influences on their thoughts and ideas about governance during that time. In Faith and Founders, Hall also draws on some initial findings of other historians, like Yale's Sidney Astrom, who estimated that, quote, 3/4 of the religious heritage, end quote, of colonists in 1776 were Reformed or Calvinists of political thought. The focus and importance here is not only on the Founding Fathers, but on American colonial society, which played a large role in protesting and resisting British tyranny during the American Revolutionary period. The writers of the Declaration of Independence and Constitution were not Reformer Calvinist influenced commoners, but they were influenced by them. And much of the supporting cast of Americans were much more inclined to reform ideas and faith than many of the elite group that historians typically focus on from this period. Hall points out that the supporting cast and leading role stars of the Declaration of Independence and Constitution were not espousing new or completely original ideas, but rather adding their own seasoned thought into very early and principled arguments based on Calvinism and Reformism that was deeply rooted in American colonial churches from founding to the Revolutionary period. Early Reformist and Calvinist views about the government could be summed up by a sermon by Jonathan Mayhem in Boston, 1750, that reiterated that Congregationalists and the Reformer view that, quote, governments are ordained by God, that their powers are limited, and that citizens have a duty to resist rulers who do evil, end quote. He explains that this is just one example of many sermons that were preached, printed, or circulated during that time period, and that Christians were to be wary of tyrannical governments and eventually helped influence the colonial fight for independence. Another of Hall's strong arguments for the consensus perspective of the Founding Fathers being less spiritual and more humanitarian or humanistic is that much of the study and writing about these men are based on actual documents themselves instead of like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. He feels that many historians have, quote, neglected the completer and more textured picture of their spirituality. This idea is supported by Wolverton's 2011 article, Faith of Our Fathers, in which he states, quote, none of the Founding Fathers were particularly evangelical, but all expressed a devotion to the teachings of Jesus Christ and the importance of a citizenry devoted to morality and virtue, end quote. This view is supported by Rohrer's book review of Ben Franklin, The Religious Life of a Founding Father in 2020, in which he states that, quote, Franklin never escaped his Puritan past, end quote, and that is exemplified in his interest in shortening the, quote, Anglican services and Book of Common Prayer so that attendance in the church would improve by attracting infirm elderly and easily bored youths, end quote. This affirms Hall's point that the Founding Fathers were far more influenced by Reformer and Calvinist beliefs than many historians give credence to. And in his conclusion, Hall reiterates that the Founding Fathers were certainly gifted individuals, but that Americans' founding should not be limited by historians who put them in the limelight. They were certainly gifted and influential, but they don't represent the many reformists influenced by, like American colonists, who did much of the heavy lifting during this period. Thank you.